The water was only 2 to 4 feet deep, just 30 yards from the shore. For months, that single geographical reality has haunted the disappearance of Lynette Hooker. On April 4th, as she and her husband Brian Hooker traveled back to their yacht, Soulmate, near Elbow Cay, a series of catastrophic events allegedly sent her overboard. He claimed she was swept away by currents in the darkness. He claimed the weather turned. But the physical evidence and the subsequent actions taken over the next 8 weeks suggest a very different sequence of events, a narrative that the mainstream timeline has entirely missed. If you want every development in this case as it happens, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this story is still moving. The official search for the missing American woman has formally ended. On June 5th, the United States Coast Guard announced the conclusion of its mission in the Bahamas, halting the deployment of divers, underwater vehicles, and a cadaver dog. But the end of the search does not mean the end of the investigation. To understand where this case is headed, we have to isolate exactly what occurred in the Abaco Islands in the northern Bahamas. According to the established timeline, Lynette and Brian Hooker had been sailing together for over a decade, documenting their travels extensively. On that Saturday evening, they were utilizing an 8-foot dinghy. Brian Hooker stated that turbulent waves, which he estimated at 2 to 4 feet, caused his wife to fall into the water. Because she was allegedly wearing the engine safety lanyard, the vessel lost power immediately. The central unanswered question is what happened in the intervening hours. The emergency was not reported to authorities until 5:12 a.m. on Sunday, April 5th. Brian Hooker maintained that he drifted and attempted to paddle with a single oar for 7 hours until he washed ashore on an adjacent island. But the forensic reality of the environment and the resources allegedly left unused on his vessel paints a picture that investigators are currently dissecting. The initial narrative of a tragic maritime accident began to fracture almost immediately. Cellular triangulation and GPS data recovered from the vessel have reportedly contradicted the locations and timelines provided to investigators. Then came the procedural anomalies. The yacht, Soulmate, was equipped with a $33,000 high-tech thermal imaging camera. In a man-overboard situation in open water, thermal tracking is the single most critical asset for locating a heat signature in the dark. That thermal camera was never activated. Why leave the most sophisticated piece of survival technology dormant while your wife is missing in the water? Witness allegations also began to surface, painting a starkly different portrait of the couple's dynamic. Lynette's daughter, Carly Allisworth, confirmed that the relationship had a history of severe friction, particularly involving alcohol. Unverified reports suggested that Lynette had intended to leave the relationship, with claims that she had even purchased a ticket to return home in March. The behavior exhibited following the disappearance further escalated scrutiny. Within hours of being released from initial holding in the Bahamas, Brian Hooker granted 3 separate network television interviews. In those statements, he publicly vowed that it would take a higher power to get him to leave the Bahamas without his wife. The very next day, he boarded an airplane and left the country. He told family members he had an urgent need to travel to Sacramento, California, citing an ill mother who required his immediate presence. For a moment, that explanation seemed to account for his sudden departure from the active search zone. It provided a socially acceptable reason for leaving the jurisdiction where his wife had vanished. But investigators tracking his movements realized he wasn't just in California. He had quietly moved into Oregon, where his son Jacob Pellegrini resides, and was actively masking his geographical footprint. By June 8th, just hours ago, visual confirmation placed him completely across the country, walking through the Centerpoint Mall in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Do you think his cross-country movements reflect the actions of a grieving husband seeking family support? Or are they deliberate maneuvers to complicate jurisdictional tracking? If the next filing changes what we covered today, you'll want to be here for it. The Michigan sighting is not a random geographic anomaly. He was spotted specifically at the Sierra store alongside his daughter Rosie. The significance of Michigan is rooted deeply in his past. It is where he and Lynette previously lived and worked. More critically, it is where he had recently secured legal counsel. Initially, he retained a state-level attorney. However, court records confirm he has now transitioned to a federal lawyer, specifically someone with prior DOJ experience as a former U.S. attorney. You do not hire former Department of Justice prosecutors for state-level accident inquiries. You hire them when you anticipate federal jurisdiction. While the Coast Guard was concluding their operations, independent searchers Marina and Nathan continued combing the waters. They focused on specific coordinates outside the primary search grid. Their efforts yielded artifacts recovered near Snapper Point Marina. This location is highly significant. It sits just north of the boatyard where Brian Hooker claimed to have washed ashore. It is also an area the couple had previously explored together on paddleboards, a location he was intimately familiar with. While the Coast Guard has not publicly connected these specific artifacts to the case, the jurisdiction of the investigation is quietly shifting. The dinghy involved in the incident has now been transferred into the custody of the Coast Guard in the Southern District of Florida. This movement strongly signals that if charges are eventually filed, federal prosecutors in Florida are preparing the jurisdictional groundwork. Throughout the investigation, Brian Hooker has presented himself as a victim of tragic circumstances, someone battling the elements and unimaginable loss. The narrative relied entirely on his credibility. Until investigators looked into his professional history at AT&T, he hadn't just been fired from his position. He was terminated because he was caught manipulating the GPS hardware on his work van to systematically mask his physical location from his employer. The technological deception utilized at AT&T mirrors the exact discrepancies investigators are now finding in his marine GPS data. The psychological profile emerging from family interviews deepens the concern. Dan Shippard and Kathy Shippard, Lynette's father and stepmother, have been cooperating with investigators for 8 weeks. Dan, a former union representative who dealt extensively with management, described Brian as an individual who harbored intense resentment toward authority. Following his termination from AT&T, Brian reportedly experienced severe depression and periods of homelessness on the beaches of Hawaii, a lifestyle he later described to the family as liberating because he was away from the man. The family confirmed that Brian and Lynette had recognized the toxicity of their alcohol consumption, achieving sobriety for a year and a half before relapsing shortly before the trip. On the day of the disappearance, both were allegedly drinking heavily. Despite the Coast Guard ending the physical search, the Royal Bahamas Police Force and federal agencies continue to build the case. Former prosecutor Julie Rendelman notes that securing a conviction in a no-body homicide requires an overwhelming matrix of circumstantial evidence. Prosecutors must prove not only that a death occurred, but that it was not the result of negligence or a tragic accident. The inconsistent statements regarding the timeline, the failure to deploy the thermal camera, and the immediate cross-country travel all serve as foundational pieces for that circumstantial matrix. This evidentiary hurdle mirrors the procedural challenges seen in the Fraunfelter case in maritime jurisdiction, where the absence of physical remains forced investigators to rely entirely on digital footprints and behavioral inconsistencies following the disappearance. The disappearance of Lynette Hooker exposes the severe vulnerabilities of maritime law, where the truth can be easily swallowed by international waters and jurisdictional red tape. If this case matters to you, the next development is one you won't want to miss. Whether the federal grand jury in the Southern District of Florida is currently reviewing the recovered GPS data to establish probable cause for an arrest, and what that data explicitly shows, is a question the court filings have not yet answered.